My son James developed paranoid delusions 14 years ago. He was initially treated as an outpatient with medication. The delusions disappeared, but he steadily deteriorated. And when he was finally admitted to hospital about a year later, he was very agitated and could barely communicate. We were told the prognosis was poor and that he would probably always need secure rehab. If you met him today, you might think he had a learning disability. His speech is simplistic. He has difficulty making decisions and problem solving. He sometimes looks unkempt and his mood can change very quickly. But now, with a lot of support, he's managing to live in his own house, and for the past 6 months, he's been working in a garden 1 or 2 mornings a week. He's slowly regaining some self-esteem and confidence, but it's been a rocky road to get here, and we've had to overcome some major obstacles, not least the battles we've had with service providers. The last 14 years have been like an emotional roller coaster, trying to cope not only with the turbulence of James's illness, but also with the ups and downs caused by services, or the lack of service. We have had 14 different psychiatrists and 24 changes of psychiatrist. Very few consultants have known him over a period of time, and there have been varying opinions about his diagnosis. They seem to have settled on paranoid schizophrenia. He is suspicious of and hostile towards many of the staff. However, I think often with good reason. Then there are the members of the community team that James calls the social workers. We've had about 15 changes of key worker or care coordinator. That might sound like an improvement on the 24 changes described earlier, until you take into account the long periods when he had no community support at all. It's hardly surprising that James, and I quote, does not engage with services. He sees the social workers as the people who put him in hospital. He finds change difficult and sometimes frightening, and he doesn't easily make relationships. For me, the changes have been frustrating and often demoralising. There have been times when I have felt truly supported by a care coordinator, knowing that there's someone else who's committed to helping James, no matter how challenging he is, and who keeps up regular contact with both James and myself, makes a world of difference. Sadly, that's been rare, and when that person leaves, it's devastating. There has been a further reorganisation recently. We've lost the consultant who knew James best and whom we both liked and trusted. The new system has reverted back to having a different consultant in each ward. In the 9 months between December 2010 and September 2011, James had 2 admissions and was seen by 4 different consultants with 6 changes. When I wrote to the trust to complain about the poor treatment he'd received, the lack of stable therapeutic relationships, and the very poor communication between professionals, I received a letter explaining that the trust now has a system of stepped care, and the more specialist expertise should be available the higher up the steps. They added, "We also believe that a change of consultant provides a fresh perspective and a second opinion, which can be very beneficial in ensuring the right treatment is provided." Theory sounds fine, but that's not my experience of the practice. In looking for that quote, I read again some of the Trust's response to my complaint, and I chose to stop because I found it so distressing. It seemed a defensive and dishonest response, full of jargonistic right-on spin, which bore no resemblance to the reality. Here lies a major problem. Despite the policies that talk about acknowledging the expertise of carers, the reality is that I don't often feel heard or believed. Professionals who see James fleetingly and make a superficial assessment hold fast to their views and are not prepared to listen. And there's a disturbing polarisation between the community and the hospital staff. The community team seem to overlook signs of disturbance, and the hospital team sees symptoms that aren't there. For example, James badly bruised my arm in temper. A nurse from the community team saw him, and even though he didn't allow her in the house and she spoke to him through the window, she found him appropriate and felt I must have provoked him. When he was eventually admitted to hospital because he wasn't coping, living on his own with too little support at that time, the hospital team thought he was responding to external stimuli because they saw him smile to himself. Neither the community nor the hospital staff recognised or addressed the real problems, which are his impaired cognition and the frustration and embarrassment he feels when he can't express himself or perform simple tasks. It was a huge relief to me when he was finally assessed by an OT last summer, and she wrote a report confirming what I'd been saying for years about his cognitive difficulties and need for support. The next battle was to convince the team that with the right support, he could stay in his own house rather than be admitted into residential care. I was told by a social worker who had never met James that I had to take out guardianship, sell his house, and force him to go into a private hospital which offered residential care. She told me that direct payments don't work for people with mental health problems. We have proved her wrong. James is now receiving an average of 25 hours a week support, funded by direct payments, and I stay with him overnight once a week. The young man who didn't engage with services has made good relationships with the 3 people who are employed as his personal assistants. I manage this on his behalf, and as far as he's concerned, one is his friend who takes him to the gym or to watch a football match at the pub. One is his boss with whom he does gardening, and the third is his cleaner and friend who takes him shopping and helps him cook healthy meals. 2 of his personal assistants work in the fire service. They stay calm in a crisis and have ways of getting into his house on the many occasions he loses his keys. The third has experience of working with people on the autistic spectrum and has done some counselling training. Recently, James has started to confide in him. We've met as a team and written an alternative care plan which focuses on his needs and interests in contrast to the care plan linked to his CTO, which is centred on his compliance with medication. I have a lot of conflicting feelings about medication. I can see that for some people it's made a dramatic difference, but not for James. The trial and error process has been very difficult, especially when some medications appear to make him worse. The physical side effects have been frightening. I worry that his present condition might have been caused by some of the earlier medications he was prescribed and some of the awful things that happened to him in hospital. This is more difficult to talk about because I feel complicit in this, and I know James blames me for supporting his admissions. Shortly after he was first discharged from hospital, he relapsed, and we had to wait for a bed to be available, during which time he started to improve. A few days after his 21st birthday, he was planning to go into town to spend his birthday money, but I kept him talking until the ambulance arrived to take him to hospital. The deterioration that followed was dramatic. On my way to visit him, I saw him outside some shops opposite the hospital. I pulled in and found him in a terrible state, drooling, unable to swallow. His speech was so slurred it was barely intelligible, and he was choking on some nuts he'd bought. I took him back to the ward where the staff hadn't noticed he was missing, and he was given something to relieve the side effects of the Accuphase injection he'd been given on admission. I sat by his bed as he sobbed and told me he hated the hospital. He was later transferred to the PICU and put on a depot and became very disturbed. His speech became rapid, incoherent, derailed and delusional. He attacked a student nurse. He refused to take his meal choice, so he wasn't given a meal. He spent a lot of time in what he called the de-steam room. He developed uncontrollable movements of his tongue and lips, which lasted for months after they stopped the depots. He was put back on his previous medication. It was a traumatic time for both of us, and I wonder how it might have been different had he not been admitted and given 2 powerful drugs which had such a devastating effect on him. That was over 10 years ago. There have been some improvements. The old Victorian hospital has been replaced by a new unit with private bedrooms, and policies on the wall describe a more patient-centred service with support for carers. But there's a huge gap between policy and practice. The past year has been particularly traumatic, and the lowest point was visiting James in seclusion, seeing him lying on a mattress in a bare room behind a glass wall, having his food put through a hatch and only able to speak to him via a telephone intercom. He'd been seen by a new community consultant who recognised his cognitive impairment and thought disorder, and he arranged for him to be admitted for a medication-free assessment. Following a really good day working in the garden, it must have felt Kafkaesque when he was visited by two people he didn't know and sectioned. He asked to go to the shop, but instead hid in the cinema. When he returned home very late at night, he was picked up by the police and told they were taking him for a KFC. Instead, they took him to hospital. The policewoman telephoned me afterwards, very upset by what then happened. Her version, different from the hospital's, was that she telephoned the ward to say he was distressed. A group of nurses then took him downstairs to a room he didn't know and began to search him, and he fought them off. He told me later he felt humiliated and angry and hit the nurse he says mocked him. He was then kept in seclusion for a week and heavily medicated until he stopped punching the walls in anger and frustration. Almost a year later, he's still on a high dose of medication. It sedates him and I think might lift his mood, although it's difficult to tell if he's happier because of the medication or because his life has dramatically improved now that he's receiving the support he needs. And there's a downside to the medication. His weight has almost doubled and he sleeps a lot, in the day as well as at night. I worry about the long-term effects. He's still cognitively impaired and possibly thought disordered. I wonder if his odd logic is due to impaired cognition and a rather childlike thinking rather than a delusional state. I would like him to be assessed by a clinical neuropsychologist, but I've given up asking. Frankly, I've had enough. I rarely contact services when there's a problem because it seems pointless. I understand James's attitude, which is keep your head down, keep taking the tablets, tell them everything's fine, and maybe you'll get them off your back. Ideally, what would I like from services? Of course, I want the best possible service for my son, and as a minimum, caring, committed staff who spend time with him and really get to know him, who respond to his needs and who can advise us on how to manage the challenges that James presents. I want him to have a fulfilling life and to be valued for who he is. I'd like hospital staff to have more supervision and training in how to diffuse aggression. And I don't think it's acceptable that there are still some staff who humiliate and patronise the vulnerable people in their care. I'd like to be truly involved in developing his care plan, and I object strongly to seeing documents which state that I have endorsed a plan that I feel is inaccurate and doesn't reflect his real needs. I would like to be present for the whole of the CPA meetings and not called in at the end when all the decisions have been made. It would also help if I were always informed of when the meetings are. I would like to become informed of changes in the service and changes of staff and consultant. I'd like my carer's assessment to be more than a tokenistic paper exercise. On a personal level, I would like an acknowledgement of my input and experience, to be listened to, and for my concerns to be taken seriously, to be seen as a partner and not a problem. But mostly, and this may sound like a contradiction, I would like to reduce my input. I would like to feel that I could trust that James is in safe hands. I'd like simply to be his mum, spend time with him because I love him, and not take on what feels like the role of his care coordinator. I'm semi-retired. I'd like to spend more time enjoying my many interests, my love of travel and my granddaughter. And I want to know that when I die, James will be safe and cared for.